Eleanor Whitfield did not cry when the last passenger left the platform. She did not cry when the station clerk looked away from her question. She did not cry when she understood, standing alone with one suitcase in the dust of Coldwater, Wyoming, that the man she had crossed 800 miles to marry had never intended to show up at all. She set her bag down on that wooden bench, folded the letter she had read 100 times, pressed it flat against her chest, and simply said to no one, "All right then. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, because this is the kind of story that doesn't end where you expect it to." Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Every single comment means the world to us. Now let's go back to that platform, and let's not leave Eleanor standing there alone. The telegram arrived at Hayes Ranch on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Eleanor Whitfield was scheduled to step off the westbound train. Thomas Hayes read it once, set it on the kitchen table, and never thought about it again. It was a confirmation, her arrival date, her trunk weight, the name of the station, all the practical details his mother had arranged without his blessing and against his explicit wishes. He folded the paper in half without reading it. A second time walked back out to the fence line where 2 of his ranch hands were waiting, and spent the rest of the day doing what he always did, working until his hands ached and his mind went quiet. He had never agreed to this arrangement. His mother, Margaret Hayes, had spent the better part of 2 years trying to convince him that a man his age needed a wife, that a ranch this size needed a woman's management. That grief, no matter how real, was not meant to be permanent. Thomas had listened to every version of this argument. He had nodded in the right places. He had never once said yes. But Margaret Hayes was not a woman who required yes. She was a woman who required results, and she had decided the result she required was a daughter-in-law. So she had placed the advertisement herself, corresponded with 3 different women over 4 months, and selected Eleanor Whitfield of Savannah, Georgia, based on 2 letters that apparently demonstrated exceptional character and practical intelligence. Margaret had shared those letters with Thomas only after the arrangement was already agreed upon. He had read them once, acknowledged they were well written, gone back to checking the cattle inventory. That was February. By June, Thomas Hayes had decided that enough was enough. He was not going to stand at a train station like a man at an auction, waiting to receive a woman he had never chosen and did not want. He sent the cancellation telegram himself, clean, direct, apologetic, in the most minimal way he could manage, to the postal address in Savannah that his mother had given him. What Thomas Hayes did not know was that Eleanor Whitfield had already left Savannah. She had been traveling for 6 days. The telegram arrived at an empty boarding house room. No one had thought to tell her. Eleanor stepped onto the platform at Coldwater Station at 2:14 in the afternoon on a Thursday in July, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that had been pressed 3 times before she left Georgia, carrying 1 large trunk and 1 smaller suitcase, with her good handbag over her left arm, and a letter from Margaret Hayes folded into the inside pocket of her coat. She was 26 years old. She had never been to Wyoming. She had never been west of Tennessee. She had never in her entire life been met at a train station by someone waiting specifically for her. She expected today to be different. The platform was crowded in the way that frontier train stations always were. Men in work clothes, moving freight women holding children, a few horses tied along the far rail. Eleanor stepped down quickly, set her suitcase at her feet, and looked around with the particular expression of a woman who is trying to appear calm while her heart is doing something considerably less calm. She looked for a man holding a sign. She looked for someone scanning the arriving passengers. She looked for anything that resembled someone expecting her. The crowd thinned. Luggage was collected. Horses were untied. Families moved toward waiting wagons. The noise of reunion voices calling out children, running, the specific joy of people finding each other, filled the platform and then slowly drained away the way water drains from a basin, until what was left was very quiet and very still. Eleanor was still standing there. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the station clerk's window. The man behind it was in his 50s with a thick gray mustache and the particular expression of someone who knows something uncomfortable and would prefer not to be the one to say it. "Excuse me," Eleanor said. "I'm looking for Thomas Hayes or anyone from Hayes Ranch. I was expected on this train." The clerk looked at her bag, looked at her face, looked back at his ledger. "Hayes Ranch," he said slowly. "That'd be north of town, about 4 miles." "Yes, I'm aware of where it is. I'm asking if anyone came to meet me." The man cleared his throat. "I don't believe I saw anyone from out that way today, ma'am." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Are you certain?" He met her eyes for just a moment. Then he looked back down at his ledger. "I'm certain." She stood at that window for another 3 seconds. She was counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Then she said, "Thank you," and walked back to the bench against the station wall, and she sat down with her suitcase at her feet and her handbag in her lap, and she looked out at the empty platform, and she breathed. She did not cry. Eleanor Whitfield had learned a long time ago that public tears were a luxury she could not afford. When you were the kind of woman the world looked at and immediately decided what you were worth, when you were the kind of woman who walked into a room and felt people's eyes make their calculations, before you had said a single word, you did not cry in public. You did not give people the satisfaction of watching you fall apart. You sat very straight. You kept your chin level, and you thought, so she thought. She had $42 left in her handbag, not enough to buy a return ticket to Georgia, not enough to rent a room in Coldwater for more than a few nights while she figured out what came next. She had sold most of what she owned to fund this journey. Her furniture, her mother's good china, 3 dresses she would never see again. She had left her position at the seamstress's shop on Briar Street because she had believed genuinely, completely believed that she was moving towards something better. Margaret Hayes's letter was still in her coat pocket. She did not take it out. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory. "My son is a good man. He has simply forgotten how to let people in. I believe a woman with strength in her hands and kindness in her heart could remind him that life is still worth living. I know you are that woman, Miss Whitfield. I know it the way you know things you cannot prove, but cannot doubt." Eleanor had read that letter and wept. Not from sadness, from recognition, because those words had described something she had spent 26 years waiting for someone to say to her, that she was seen, that she was wanted, that she was worth the journey. She had packed her one remaining suitcase that very night. Now she sat alone on the bench in Wyoming while the afternoon light stretched long and golden across an empty platform, and a few stray dogs investigated the base of a water trough. And she understood with the quiet clarity of someone who has absorbed too much disappointment to be surprised by it anymore that she had been wrong. It was another 20 minutes before she accepted that no one was coming. She stood up, straightened her dress, picked up her suitcase, and walked back to the clerk's window. "Is there a wagon for hire?" she asked. "I need transportation to Hayes Ranch." The clerk looked at her. This time he did not look away quickly. He looked at her with something that might have been pity, which Eleanor liked even less than the avoidance. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I don't know that you'd want to." "I didn't ask your opinion," Eleanor said. "I asked about a wagon." He pointed to a man leaning against the far post of the station building. "Hector runs a wagon for hire. He'll take you where you need to go." Eleanor walked to the man named Hector, negotiated a price that was 3 cents lower than he asked for, and waited while he hitched his horse. While she waited, she became aware that she was being watched. Not stared at. Frontier people were too practical for outright staring, but watched. A woman by the dry goods store across the street had her eyes on Eleanor with an expression that carried a particular kind of female assessment, the kind that took in the fuller figure, the traveling dress, the solitary situation, and arrived at a verdict before any evidence had been considered. 2 men near the livery were talking in low voices and glancing over. A child pointed, and his mother pulled his arm down and turned him away. Eleanor had spent her entire life being looked at that way, not with hatred, never with open cruelty, just with the mild and constant dismissal of people who had decided based on the evidence of her body that she was not worth their full attention. Too large, too ordinary, too easy to overlook. She had grown up in a house where her sister, smaller, lighter, quicker to smile, had been called beautiful so often that the word seemed permanently attached to her name, and Eleanor had been called capable, which was what adults said when they wanted to be kind about the truth of what they saw. She knew what she looked like. She had made her peace with it years ago, or she thought she had. Standing on this platform in Wyoming, in a town she had never seen before, waiting for a wagon that would take her to a man who hadn't wanted her. She felt something she didn't usually allow herself to feel. Not grief, not shame, fury. Clean, cold, purposeful fury. Not at Thomas Hayes. Not yet. Not at Margaret Hayes, who had meant well and caused harm with her good intentions. Not at the town of Coldwater, which was only doing what towns always did, which was looking and judging and moving on. She was furious at herself, for believing, for packing, for selling her mother's china for $40 and using it to cross half a continent toward a man who had written to cancel the arrangement and hadn't even made sure the cancellation arrived in time. She climbed into Hector's wagon when it was ready, and she sat very straight on the bench beside him, and she held her handbag in both hands, and she did not say a word for the first mile. Then Hector said carefully, "You're the woman Thomas Hayes was expecting." "I'm the woman his mother was expecting," Eleanor said. "Apparently there's a difference." Hector said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Thomas is a decent man. He ain't been right since Clara died." Eleanor turned to look at him. Clara, his wife, passed 4 years back. Fever took her in the spring. He kept his eyes on the road. He closed up after that. Works the land, minds his business, don't let nobody in. Margaret his ma, she means well. But Thomas didn't agree to this. Word around town is he canceled the whole thing. "I know he canceled it," Eleanor said. "I'm going there anyway." Hector glanced at her sideways. She could feel him reassessing. "What for?" "Because I spent everything I had to come here," Eleanor said, "and I deserve to hear it from him directly." Hector said, "Yes, ma'am." And that was the end of that conversation. Hayes Ranch appeared at the top of a long rise, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see what no one had been taking care of. The fence posts along the south side were leaning at angles that had nothing to do with the wind. The garden beside the main house had gone to weeds 3 seasons ago at least. 2 of the outbuildings needed new wood on their faces. The place had the look of a man who had been surviving instead of living, keeping what mattered most and letting everything else slowly come apart. She cataloged it without meaning to. It was how her mind worked. Numbers and details and the specific arithmetic of what something needed versus what it had. She had managed the books at her uncle's hardware shop in Savannah for 4 years before the arrangement with his business partner forced her out. She knew what neglect looked like on paper, and she knew what it looked like on a fence line, and both were telling her the same story about Thomas Hayes. The wagon stopped at the main gate. Eleanor climbed down without assistance, picked up her suitcase, and walked to the door. She knocked 3 times. No answer. She knocked again. A voice from around the side of the house, rough and startled. "Who's there?" "Eleanor Whitfield," she said clearly. "From Savannah. I believe you were expecting me." A long silence. Then the sound of boots on hard ground, and Thomas Hayes came around the corner of the house with a hammer still in his hand, and an expression on his face that she could only describe as a man who has been caught doing something he is not ashamed of, but also was not prepared to explain. How was taller than she had pictured, wide in the shoulders, a face that might have been handsome in a lighter mood, but was currently doing the work of a door that had been shut for a long time. His eyes went to her suitcase, to her face, to the wagon pulling away at the gate, and then back to her face. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and then stopped. "Mr. Hayes," Eleanor said. "I know you sent the cancellation. I didn't receive it in time. I'd like to come in and speak with you directly if that's acceptable." He stopped again, looked at the hammer, set it against the side of the house. "The telegram. Went to an empty room in Savannah," Eleanor said. "I was already on the train. I understand that wasn't your intention, but here I am, and I'd prefer not to have this conversation in your yard." Thomas Hayes looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not contempt, not pity, something more complicated than either. Then he said, "Come in," and held the door. The inside of the house told the same story as the outside. Not dirty, he was clearly a man who kept things in basic order, but stripped down. Empty walls where pictures had hung. Chairs that had been pushed against walls because there was no longer any reason to arrange them around conversation. A kitchen that smelled of coffee, and nothing else when a kitchen should smell of 10 things at once. He gestured toward the kitchen table, and she sat down, setting her suitcase against the wall and her handbag on the table in front of her. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one. She noticed that. Small kindness. Automatic not considered. Which told her something about who he had been before the shutting down. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas said, "I owe you an apology. The telegram should have been sent sooner." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "It should have been." "I didn't know you'd already left Georgia." "No, you didn't." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. She watched his jaw work slightly, the way men's jaws worked when they were trying to determine how to say something they hadn't decided yet. "I didn't agree to this arrangement," he said finally. "My mother—" "I know your mother arranged it," Eleanor said. "She wrote to me for 4 months. I have her letters. She told me you were a good man who had forgotten how to live. She told me she believed I could remind you." She paused. "I understand now that she was making that decision for both of us, and neither of us agreed to it entirely." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but the slight opening of a door. "She means well," he said quietly. "I know she does," Eleanor said. "And I'm not here to argue about who meant what. I'm here because I spent every dollar I owned to make this trip, and I have $42 left in my bag, and I don't have a return ticket, and I'm not willing to sit at a train station and cry about it." She met his eyes. "I came to tell you that I heard the situation as it is. I don't expect you to marry me. I never expected you to marry me without meeting me first. I'd like to think I have more sense than that, but I'd like to know if you have any work available on this ranch, because I have practical skills, and I'm not afraid of hard work, and I need a position until I can afford to determine what comes next." Thomas looked at her. He looked at her the way people almost never looked at Eleanor, not as though he were measuring, but as though he were listening. Really listening. The way you listened to something that had surprised you into paying attention. "What kind of practical skills?" he asked. "I managed accounts for 4 years," she said. "I can read a ledger, catch an error, and tell you within 10 minutes whether your supplier agreements are fair. I can cook, preserve, and organize a household. I can manage a garden from bare soil to table. I notice things other people don't notice, and I remember what I notice." She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd need to see what you can do." "That's fair," Eleanor said. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll give you 2 weeks. There's a room above the barn, it's clean and it's warm and it's private. Meals at the house. $1.50 a week." He paused. "That's what I'd pay a hand." "A hand does physical labor from dawn to dusk," Eleanor said. "I'll be doing that and managing your books. I'd say $2 a week is fair." He looked at her. She looked back. $2, he said. "Fine." She picked up her coffee cup. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." He picked up his. "There'll be people in town who talk," he said. "They'll say things about the arrangement and about you being here." "People have been saying things about me my entire life," Eleanor said. "I've learned to keep working while they do it." Something happened to his face then. Something she wasn't sure he was aware of. A slight relaxation around the eyes. The very beginning of something that might in a different season become a smile. He did not smile. But it was close. "I'll show you the room," he said, and stood up, and she followed him out through the back of the house, and the Wyoming afternoon wrapped around them both, and Eleanor Whitfield, who had cried on exactly 0 train platforms, and intended to keep that record, walked into the second chapter of a story she had not expected to find herself living. She had not come to Wyoming to be saved. She had come to save herself. And she was just getting started. 3 hours after Eleanor settled into the room above the barn, a clean space just as he'd promised, with a good window and a solid bed and a hook on the wall that she used immediately for her second dress, she heard voices from the yard below. She wasn't trying to listen, but the window was cracked against the summer heat, and the voices carried. A woman's voice first. Sharp. Not unkind in the way that cruelty is unkind, but the kind of sharpness that came from certainty. The voice of a woman who had decided what everything was long before she arrived at it. Thomas Hayes, that woman is still on your property. She's working Doris. She's a mail-order bride you rejected. There's a name for a woman who stays after a man says no. A pause. She asked for work. I gave her work. That's the end of it. It is not the end of it. This is a small town, Thomas. People are already talking. You had a woman shipped in like a piece of furniture, and now you've got her sleeping in your barn, and you think nobody is going to... Doris. His voice was flat, final. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave this alone. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to manage me. Those are different things. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a woman who has been checked and knows it and is deciding whether to push further or retreat. She retreated. Eleanor heard footsteps moving away, a horse, the creak of a buggy. Then quiet. Then from directly below the window, Thomas Hayes's voice, not directed at Eleanor, not directed at anyone, just spoken into the open air, the way a man sometimes spoke when he thought he was alone. Damn this town. Eleanor allowed herself very quietly the smallest smile she'd had in 6 days. She unpacked her suitcase. She folded her dresses into the small chest of drawers by the window. She set her mother's Bible on the windowsill, the one thing she had refused to sell. She laid out her writing kit on the side table, because she intended to write to Margaret Hayes that evening, and she intended to be precise about what she wrote. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and did what she had not allowed herself to do since Savannah. She let herself feel it, all of it. The embarrassment of that platform, the weight of those $42, the particular ache of having believed something completely and found it hollow, the way the station clerk had looked away, the way the town had watched her without quite looking at her, the way Thomas Hayes had stood there with a hammer in his hand, looking at a woman he had refused, and had the grace at least to seem bothered by what his refusal had cost her. She felt all of it. She did not cry, but she felt it. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, picked up her notebook, and went downstairs to find the ranch accounts. Because Eleanor Whitfield had not traveled 800 miles to feel sorry for herself. She had come here to prove something. Not to Thomas Hayes. Not to Coldwater, Wyoming. Not to the woman named Doris, with the sharp voice and the quick verdict. To herself. The accounts were in a box under the kitchen table, 3 years of ledgers, a stack of supplier invoices bound with twine, and 2 letters from a man named Gerald Finch at the Coldwater Territorial Bank that Eleanor read twice slowly, with a steadily deepening expression. Thomas came in from the yard as she was reading the second letter for the 3rd time. "Those are private records," he said, stopping in the kitchen doorway. "You hired me to manage them," Eleanor said without looking up. "I'm managing them." A pause. I said I'd see what you could do. I didn't say you could..." "Mr. Hayes." She set the letter down and looked at him. "Do you know what your current operating deficit is?" He said nothing. "Because it's significant," Eleanor said. "Your hay supplier has been overcharging you by roughly 14% for at least 2 years, based on market rates I can verify from this letter. Your fence repair costs are double what they should be because you're not bulk ordering the lumber. And this letter," she held it up, "from Mr. Finch at the bank. The one from 8 months ago is a notice that your property tax payment was applied to the wrong parcel. Which means you've been overpaying on parcel 42 and underpaying on parcel 17. And if the county assessor has noticed, which they may have, you have a legal exposure you don't know about." Thomas Hayes stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at the woman who had arrived unwanted on his property 12 hours ago. He did not look dismissive. He looked the way people looked when they heard something true they weren't prepared to hear. "How do you know all that?" he said finally. "Because I read things carefully," Eleanor said. "And because nobody expects me to." He walked to the table, pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, looked at the letter she had set between them. "Show me," he said. Eleanor picked up her pencil. "All right, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Let's start from the beginning." And outside the Wyoming evening came on slowly, and the ranch was quiet, and the woman that no one had come to collect at the train station sat across from the man who had not wanted her and showed him line by line, dollar by dollar, everything he had been losing without knowing it. And something shifted in that room. Not love. Not yet. Not even close. But the first faint possibility of something that might, if carefully tended, become trust. And in the West, trust was the beginning of everything. The next morning began before sunrise. Eleanor had not slept well, but she had slept enough, and she had learned long ago that the difference between a woman who survived hard things and a woman who didn't was not strength or talent or even luck. It was the decision made quietly and without ceremony to get up anyway. So she got up. She dressed in the dark, pinned her hair without a mirror, and was down the barn stairs and crossing the yard before the first edge of light appeared over the eastern ridge. She had the ranch ledgers tucked under one arm and a list she had written by lamplight the night before. 17 items organized by urgency, with estimated costs beside each one. Thomas Hayes was already in the yard. Howe was doing what she was beginning to understand he always did before the day officially started checking things. The fence along the east pasture, the water level in the trough, the horses, the state of the tool shed door that had been hanging wrong on its hinges for what looked like a considerable amount of time. He moved through the property the way a man moved through a place he loved but had stopped seeing automatically efficiently and without joy. He saw her and stopped. "You're up early," he said. "I made a list," Eleanor said, and held it out to him. He took it, read it. His expression did not change, but something around his eyes tightened in the way that meant he was taking it more seriously than he intended to show. "This is," he started. 17 items, she said. "The first 5 are the most urgent. The hay supplier issue alone is costing you somewhere between $200 and $240 a year. I'd like to ride into town today and check the current market rate at the feed store, which will give me the exact number." "You want to ride into town?" he said. "Is there a problem with that?" He looked at the list again. "People will talk." "People are already talking," Eleanor said. "I heard Mrs. Doris, I believe, from my window last night. She's made up her mind about the situation. I don't think anything I do in town today is going to make that worse." Thomas was quiet for a moment. She had the sense he was deciding whether to argue the point, and then deciding it wasn't worth the energy. "There's a bay mare in the second stall," he said. "She's steady. You can take her." "Thank you," Eleanor said. He handed the list back. "That tool shed door, I know about it. The hinge pin cracked back in April. I just haven't had time." "I noticed," Eleanor said. "I put it at number 11 because it's not urgent, but a cracked hinge left long enough becomes a broken door, and a broken door in winter is a serious problem." He looked at her, not the way he had looked at her last night when he was deciding whether she was worth his time. He looked at her the way you looked at something that kept being more than you expected it to be. "I'll fix the hinge today," he said. "Good," Eleanor said, and went to saddle the bay mare. The ride into cold water took 40 minutes and told her several things she needed to know. The road into town passed 3 other properties. The alderman spread a smaller homestead she didn't yet have a name for, and what appeared to be an abandoned claim that had gone back to grass. She catalogued all 3 without meaning to the way she catalogued everything. Details had always been her defense. When you paid close attention to the world around you, the world had slightly less power to surprise you in ways you couldn't recover from. Coldwater itself was the kind of town that would have been called modest in polite company and small in honest company. One main street a bank, a dry goods store, a livery, a church whose paint had been fading for at least a decade, and a saloon that appeared to be the most prosperous establishment in the county. There was a feed store at the south end of the main street, which was where Eleanor went first. The man behind the counter was young mid-20s with an open, uncomplicated face and the particular expression of someone who recognized her before she'd said a single word. Of course he did. Word in a town this size moved faster than horses. "Morning, ma'am," he said carefully. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "I need the current rate on prairie hay loose and baled, and I'd like to know what your delivery charge is to Hayes Ranch if the order is above 500 pounds, he told her. She wrote the numbers down. They were exactly what she had suspected. The number Thomas had been paying his current supplier was not 14% over market rate. It was 19. She thanked the young man, walked out of the feed store, and stood for a moment in the morning air, doing arithmetic that made her simultaneously pleased, because she'd been right, and furious on Thomas Hayes's behalf, because 19% overmarket on hay for a ranch of that size, compounded over the 2 years she could verify from the ledgers, was close to $600. $600 that had walked out of Hayes Ranch through a combination of inattention and the particular arrogance of a supplier who believed that a grieving man too deep in his own sorrow to check numbers was a man worth exploiting. She was walking back toward her horse when she heard her name. Not her name exactly. She heard "that woman from Hayes Ranch," which was what she had become in Coldwater already, and she turned to find the source. 3 women stood outside the dry goods store. One of them was Doris. Eleanor recognized the voice from last night before she recognized the face. Doris was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a frontier way, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously concerned and satisfied, the expression of a woman who had discovered that her concerns were justified, and found this more validating than troubling. The other 2 were younger. One looked away when Eleanor met her eyes. The other did not. "Miss Whitfield," Doris said, stepping forward with the confidence of a woman who considered herself the spokesperson for the collective opinion of Coldwater. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I want you to know that nobody in this town thinks poorly of you personally," Doris said in the tone people used when what they were about to say was going to prove the opposite. "You were clearly misled by the situation. Margaret Hayes should never have made promises on behalf of her son without his agreement. That is the truth, and most people here would admit it." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "But..." Doris paused for the particular weight of the word. "Your remaining at Hayes Ranch in the current arrangement is not appropriate. I think you must know that." "I'm working," Eleanor said. "I have a professional arrangement with Mr. Hayes. I manage accounts and household administration. He pays me a fair wage. That's the arrangement." Doris's expression did a complicated thing. "My dear, Mrs. Eleanor paused because she didn't actually know Doris's last name. "I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your full name." "Doris Carmichael," the woman said, slightly thrown. "Mrs. Carmichael, I appreciate your concern, but I've been managing accounts professionally for 4 years, and I've already found a significant financial problem in Mr. Hayes's records that will save him a considerable amount of money. I'm good at my work. I intend to keep doing it until I've saved enough to determine my next steps. That is all that is happening at Hayes Ranch." She looked at the woman steadily. "I hope that clarifies the situation." Doris opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "People will talk regardless," she said, but the sharpness had softened just slightly. "People talked about me before I arrived," Eleanor said. "I expect they'll continue, but I'd rather be talked about as a woman who works than as one who left when things got difficult." She picked up her horse's reins. "Good morning, Mrs. Carmichael." She rode back to Hayes Ranch with the feed store numbers in her notebook and the conversation replaying in her head. Not with anxiety, but with the careful attention of a woman building a picture of the territory she had landed in. Doris Carmichael was not a villain. Eleanor had dealt with villains. Doris was something more common and, in some ways, harder to navigate, a woman who had decided what was right based on the assumption that her version of right was the only one available. The town had clearly taken its social cues from her for some time, which meant that whatever Eleanor built here, she would build against that current. She didn't mind currents. She had been swimming against one her entire life. Thomas was at the kitchen table when she came in the tool shed. Hingepin on the table beside him, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow, a letter in his hand that he set face down when she entered. She noticed and didn't comment. "The hay supplier has been overcharging you by 19%, she said, setting her notebook on the table. "Not 14. I had the numbers wrong last night because I was working from the older invoices. The more recent ones are worse." She sat down across from him. "Over 2 years, based on what I can verify in the ledgers, you've overpaid that supplier by approximately $580. Thomas looked at the number she had written. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "Dawson's been selling to this ranch since my father's time," he said finally. "Then he's been doing it longer than 2 years, and you've lost more than I can verify from these records," Eleanor said. I can write him a letter today if you want, or you can ride over and speak to him directly. Either way, I'd recommend canceling the current agreement and contracting with Coldwater Feed at the market rate. They have a delivery arrangement for orders over £500. Thomas set the letter, the face-down one, to the side of the table. Write the letter, he said. I'll review it before it goes. Of course, Eleanor said. She pulled a sheet of paper from her writing kit. She was half through the first draft when Thomas said, without looking up from the hinge pin he had started examining, I met with Doris Carmichael this morning. Eleanor kept writing. She came out here. She and her husband. Gerald Carmichael runs the bank. A pause. Gerald is a decent man. Doris has opinions. I met her in town, Eleanor said. Thomas looked up. How did that go? She told me my arrangement here was inappropriate. Eleanor kept her pen moving. I told her it was professional. She seemed partially convinced, or at least uncertain enough to table the argument. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but something near the neighborhood of it. You told Doris Carmichael she was uncertain. I told her I hoped I'd clarified the situation, Eleanor said carefully, which I believe is the same thing stated more diplomatically. This time it was unmistakably close to a smile. It didn't arrive, but it was definitely close. He went back to the hinge pin. She finished the letter. By noon, she had drafted correspondence to the hay supplier, identified a discrepancy in the lumber account that pointed to a second overcharging situation with a man named Gideon Walsh, who ran the building supply in the next county, and reorganized the last 8 months of receipts into a system that would allow Thomas to find anything he needed in under 2 minutes. By mid-afternoon, she was in the neglected kitchen garden with a hoe she'd found in the tool shed, doing nothing as dramatic as replanting, just clearing the 3 worst sections of encroaching grass so the soil could breathe. It was not in her job description. She did it anyway because neglected things bothered her in a physical way, the way a loose button bothered certain people until they sat down and sewed it back on. Thomas came around the corner of the house and stopped. That's not, I didn't ask you to do that, he said. No, Eleanor agreed, not stopping. The garden isn't part of our arrangement. You're right. She kept clearing. I'll stop if you'd prefer. He watched her for a long moment. Clara planted that garden, he said. His voice had changed, flattened, the way voices flattened when they were carrying something heavy. The roses along the far side. She brought the cuttings from her mother's place in Missouri. Eleanor stopped. She looked at the rose bed along the fence, which was not dead. Roses were stubborn things, and these had continued without anyone tending them, a little wild, a little desperate, but alive. She looked back at Thomas. I'll leave the roses, she said. I'm only clearing the grass from the vegetable section. I was quiet for a moment. She used to say a garden that nobody tended was a garden that nobody deserved, he said very quietly, as though he wasn't quite sure he intended to say it out loud. Eleanor considered that. She sounds like a practical woman. She was. He looked at the rose bed. Something moved across his face. Grief old and quiet, and deeply settled in the kind that had stopped being sharp, and was now just the constant low pressure of a life reshaped around an absence. She would have said you were right about the hay supplier. She kept those books before. He stopped. Before. Eleanor did not push on the before. The vegetable beds were hers too, she asked. Everything in this yard was hers, Thomas said. I don't. He stopped again, pressed his lips together. I don't have time for a garden. You don't have to, Eleanor said. I'll see to it. Consider it part of the arrangement. He looked at her, then a direct look, the kind he hadn't given her often, the kind that meant he was actually seeing her rather than processing her presence. Why, he said. You don't owe this place anything. I like gardens, Eleanor said simply. And this one is trying very hard to survive without any help. I find that admirable. She turned back to her clearing. Also, tomatoes in August will reduce your food costs, and I prefer to justify everything in practical terms. This time he did smile. Small brief gone in a second, but real. The first real one she had seen. He picked up the second hoe from where she'd leaned it against the fence and joined her without another word. They worked side by side for an hour. Not talking, just working. And Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected to feel in Wyoming. Something that was not comfort exactly, because comfort implied ease, and nothing about this situation was easy. Something more like the particular rightness of useful work done alongside another person who understood what useful work was. It lasted until the sound of a horse coming fast up the ranch road broke the quiet. Thomas dropped the hoe and was at the gate before Eleanor had straightened up. The rider was young, one of the alderman boys from the property she'd passed that morning, and his face had the white pressed look of someone delivering bad news. "Mr. Hayes," the boy said, pulling his horse up hard. "My pa sent me. There's a man from the county assessor's office in town. He's been at the bank talking to Mr. Carmichael." Thomas went still. "What about—" "Pa didn't hear everything, but he heard your name and parcel 17, and he heard the man from the assessor say something about a delinquency notice." Eleanor stepped forward before she meant to. "The tax payment," she said. "The one that was applied to the wrong parcel." Thomas turned to look at her. "The letter from Mr. Finch at the bank," she said. "8 months ago. The payment was applied to parcel 42 instead of 17. I mentioned it last night." She met his eyes. If that wasn't corrected, the county may have flagged parcel 17 as delinquent. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man understanding that a problem he didn't know he had was now urgently real. "How bad can it get?" Thomas said. "If the delinquency was filed officially, they can begin seizure proceedings after 30 days, Eleanor said. "I don't know when it was filed. I don't know if it was filed. But we need to find out today." She was already untying her apron. "I need those bank letters, all of them, and the original tax receipt from 2 years ago if you have it." "I don't know where—" "I'll find it," Eleanor said. "Where do you keep older documents?" "There's a box in this back room. Clara used to—" He caught himself. "Back room, bottom shelf, blue tin box." Eleanor was already moving toward the house. She heard Thomas telling the alderman boy to ride back and tell his father, "Thank you," and then she heard Thomas's boots on the porch behind her, and then they were both in the back room, and she was on her knees pulling out the blue tin box that she would have bet everything was exactly where Clara had put it. It was. 3 years of property tax receipts, organized by date with each parcel noted in a handwriting that was neat and small and not Thomas's. Eleanor lifted them out one by one until she found what she needed. The receipt from 2 years ago. Parcel marked payment noted bank stamp across the bottom. She held it up. "Parcel 42, she said. "Not 17, just as the bank letter said. This means the error originated at the bank, not the county. Which means the county's delinquency notice, if there is one, is based on bad information that can be corrected." She was already standing. "We need to get to the bank before it closes." Thomas looked at the receipt in her hand and then at her face. "You found that in 4 minutes." "The box was organized by year," Eleanor said. "Clara was meticulous." Something crossed his face when she said the name. The same thing that always crossed it, that low-pressure grief. But this time, something else was underneath it. Something that looked for a fraction of a second like the specific pain of recognizing that you had not been the only one who loved someone, and that love once built persisted in small organized tin boxes long after the person who built it was gone. "We need to go," Eleanor said more gently. "Yes," Thomas said. And then, "Thank you." It was the first time he had said it directly without the formal courtesy of the first night. It meant something different now. She could hear the difference. "Let's thank me after we fix it," Eleanor said. They rode into town together, and the people of Coldwater, who happened to be on the main street at 4 in the afternoon, saw Thomas Hayes and the woman from the train station ride in side by side with the specific purposeful urgency of two people who had something important to settle. And if some of those people had opinions about that, they kept them to themselves because Thomas Hayes's expression was the expression of a man who was currently not interested in anyone's opinions. Gerald Carmichael was still at the bank. How was a trim man in his late 50s with careful eyes and the measured manner of someone who had spent decades handling other people's money and other people's problems. He rose when they came in. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Thomas. He looked at the receipt Eleanor set on his desk without preamble. "The payment was applied to the wrong parcel," Eleanor said. "Parcel 42 instead of 17. I believe you sent a letter about this 8 months ago." Gerald looked at the receipt, opened his ledger, ran his finger down a column, closed the ledger. "We sent the letter," he said. "We never received a response." "The letter wasn't followed up on," Thomas said. "No," Gerald admitted. "It should have been. That's an oversight on our part. Mr. Hayes and I apologize for it." He looked at Eleanor. "You are Eleanor Whitfield," she said. "I manage Mr. Hayes's accounts." Gerald looked between them, arrived at a diplomatic absence of expression. "I see. Well, Miss Whitfield, the good news is that the delinquency notice was filed by the county last month, but it was only filed, it hasn't been acted on. If we correct the payment record today and send a formal notice to the county assessor, the filing should be vacated within the week." "Can you do that today?" Eleanor asked. "I can start the process today," Gerald said. "Good," Eleanor said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited to sit. "I'd also like to discuss the general state of the Hayes accounts while we're here, because I've identified several issues I'd like your perspective on." Gerald Carmichael looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him with an expression that said quite clearly, "She is the one running this meeting." Gerald sat down. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Eleanor had established that the bank had made 2 additional clerical errors in the Hayes accounts over the past 3 years, both minor, both correctable, and had also learned from a comment Gerald let slip, when he was sufficiently off balance, that a man named William Carter had been asking questions at the bank about the Hayes property boundaries. She filed that away and said nothing until they were outside. Then she said, "Who is William Carter?" Thomas stopped walking. "Where did you hear that name?" "Carmichael mentioned him. He didn't mean to. He was talking about property boundary inquiries, and he said Carter's name and then caught himself." She looked at Thomas. He went quiet after that, which usually means the subject is sensitive. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of a man dealing with something he'd been managing to not deal with, and was now finding he could no longer avoid. "William Carter owns the Meridian Ranch," Thomas said. "East of my property. He's been trying to buy my Southfield for 2 years. I said no. He's the kind of man who doesn't accept no as a final answer." "What does that mean practically?" Eleanor said. "It means he has a lawyer in Cheyenne," Thomas said. "It means every time there's anything questionable in my records or my title, it gets back to that lawyer somehow. It means—" He stopped, put his hat back on. "It means I've been fighting off a land dispute for 18 months that I thought I had handled." Eleanor looked at him. "And the property tax delinquency notice," she said slowly. "If that had gone unaddressed, it would have given Carter's lawyer something to work with," Thomas said. He said it quietly, the way you said things when you'd figured out something unpleasant. "Do you think Carter knew about the misfiled payment?" Eleanor asked. Thomas looked at her. "Gerald Carmichael and William Carter," he said, "play cards together every Thursday night." The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the specific discomfort of a picture coming together that you would have preferred to remain blurry. "All right," Eleanor said. "Then we have more work to do than I thought." "Miss Whitfield." "Eleanor," she said, "if we're going to fight a land dispute together, Mr. Hayes, I think we can manage first names." He looked at her for a moment. With that expression, she was beginning to recognize the one that meant she had surprised him again, and he was recalibrating. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she said. "Here's what I know: the tax notice is being corrected. The bank errors are on record as bank errors. Carter can't use those. But if he's looking for weaknesses in your title, there may be others I haven't found yet. I need to go through everything. All the property documents, the original land grant, every survey record you have." "That's—" Thomas looked across the street at nothing in particular. "That's going to take time." "Then we'd better start tonight," Eleanor said. They rode back to Hayes Ranch in the long light of the Wyoming evening, and something had changed between them that neither of them said anything about. Not affection, not trust, Quite trust was earned in longer increments than this. But the particular alignment that happened between two people who had faced something difficult together and found that they had faced it well. At the gate, Thomas said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead," Eleanor said. "Why are you doing this?" He was looking at his hands on the reins. "You don't have a stake in this land. You don't have any reason to." "I told you why," Eleanor said. "I have $42 and I need this position." "That's not the whole reason," Thomas said. She looked at him. He was looking back now, and the question was genuine, not an accusation, not a test. Just a man trying to understand a person he hadn't expected to find standing in his life. Eleanor considered her answer for a moment. She thought about the tin box with Clara's handwriting, the rose cuttings from Missouri still growing along the fence, the ledgers that no one had properly tended in years, the fence posts leaning at wrong angles. "Because this place deserves better than what's been happening to it," she said finally. "And so do you." She paused. "And I have never in my life been able to walk away from something that was being neglected when I could see exactly what it needed." Thomas held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Thank you, Eleanor." She nodded, climbed down from the mare. "I'll start on the property documents after supper," she said, and walked toward the barn. Behind her she heard Thomas dismount, heard him pause, heard him in a voice quieter than she'd heard from him. Yet the voice of a man saying something he'd almost forgotten how to say. Say to no one in particular, or possibly to the evening air, or possibly to the ghost of the woman who had organized everything in blue tin boxes. "Lord, Clara, she's something." Eleanor did not acknowledge that she'd heard it, but she climbed the stairs to her room above the barn and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself for the second time in 2 days to feel something she hadn't expected. Not hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what Eleanor Whitfield allowed herself. But the solid, grounded, practical precursor to hope. The sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside. Thomas Hayes lit the lamp in his kitchen and sat down at the table with the property documents she had asked for and began sorting them into order so she could start tonight. It was the first time in 4 years that he had lit the lamp for any reason other than himself. The property documents took 3 nights. Eleanor worked at the kitchen table after supper each evening, while Thomas sat across from her, sometimes answering questions, sometimes just present in the way that a person could be present when they had decided without announcing it that they no longer wanted to be alone in a room. He brought coffee without being asked. She stopped thanking him for it after the second night, because it had become the kind of thing that didn't require acknowledgement anymore, the small wordless grammar of 2 people learning each other's rhythms. On the first night, she found the original land grant from 1871, signed by Thomas's father, covering 4 parcels, totaling just over 900 acres. On the second night, she found a survey record from 1879 with a boundary notation that didn't match the land grant description by roughly 40 feet along the southern edge, the edge that bordered William Carter's Meridian Ranch. She set her pen down and looked at that number for a long time. 40 feet. In farming terms, 40 feet was nothing. In legal terms, in the hands of a lawyer looking for leverage, 40 feet was a door left unlocked. "Thomas," she said. He looked up from the fence repair invoice he'd been reviewing. She turned the survey record around and pushed it across the table. "This boundary notation. Does this match what you understand to be your southern property line?" He studied it, pulled the land grant over and compared. She watched his face do the slow, controlled work of a man who was beginning to understand something he wished he didn't understand. "These are different," he said. "By 40 feet, Eleanor said. "Along the southern edge, which is the edge Carter has been disputing." Thomas leaned back in his chair. He pressed both hands flat on the table. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking the discrepancy could be a surveyor's error from 1879, Eleanor said carefully. "Surveyor errors happened often. Instruments were imprecise. It may mean nothing." She paused. "Or it may mean that Carter's lawyer found this before we did, and the land dispute he's been pursuing for 18 months is built on this 40-foot difference, which would make his case considerably stronger than you realized." The silence in the kitchen was the specific kind that happened when someone heard the thing they had been hoping not to hear confirmed. "How strong?" Thomas said. I don't know enough about territorial land law to answer that, Eleanor said. You need a lawyer. I had a lawyer, last year. Cost me $60 and he told me Carter didn't have a case. He may have missed this, Eleanor said. Or it may not change anything. But you need someone to look at both documents together before Carter's lawyer uses them separately. She held his gaze. Who's the best land attorney in Cheyenne? Thomas looked at her. How do you know to ask about Cheyenne? Because you said Carter's lawyer was in Cheyenne, which means the legal action, if it comes, will come from there. You need someone in the same city who knows the same judges. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, a man named Aldous Reeve. He handled my father's estate. He's expensive. How expensive? $120 for a full review. Eleanor did the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head for 2 days. The savings from the hay supplier correction annualized. The lumber account discrepancy. The bank errors. She pulled her notebook over and wrote the number at the bottom of a column. You'll have that money recovered within 4 months from the supplier corrections alone, she said. Write to Reeve tomorrow. Send him copies of both documents. She tapped the survey record and the land grant. Don't send originals. I'll make the copies tonight. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Eleanor. Yes. You have been here for 9 days. I know. In 9 days you have found $600 in supplier overcharges, corrected a tax delinquency that could have given Carter legal standing, identified a potential weakness in my property documents, and reorganized 3 years of records. He paused. And planted tomatoes. The tomatoes were a personal decision, Eleanor said. I'm not criticizing the tomatoes. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. I'm trying to understand what you're doing. I told you what I'm doing. I'm managing your accounts. Eleanor. His voice had shifted. Lower. More direct. I'm not asking about the accounts. She set her pen down. She looked at him across the table, this man who had been shut for 4 years, who was currently looking at her with the careful, tentative expression of someone opening a window they weren't sure was safe to open. I'm doing what I know how to do, she said finally. When I don't know what's going to happen next, I focus on what's in front of me. What's in front of me is a ranch that deserves to survive and a set of problems I know how to solve. She met his eyes. That's all it is. Thomas looked at her for another moment. Then he said quietly, no, it isn't. But he didn't push further, and she didn't answer, and they both went back to the documents. She made the copies by lamplight after he went to bed. Her hand was steady. Her mind was not. Because the truth, the one she hadn't said, was more complicated than what she'd told him. The truth was that she had been on this ranch for 9 days, and she had started caring about it in a way that frightened her, because caring about things you didn't own and couldn't keep was the surest road to the kind of pain she had promised herself she was done with. She pressed her pen to the paper and kept copying. The letter to Aldous Reeve went out the following morning. 2 days later, something else arrived. A rider from Carter's Meridian Ranch carrying a sealed envelope addressed to Thomas Hayes. Eleanor was in the garden when the rider came in. She watched from where she stood as Thomas took the envelope, read the rider's face for information, the man's face for information. The man's expression carefully didn't offer and went inside without opening it. She gave him 10 minutes. Then she went in. I was standing at the kitchen window with the letter open in his hand and an expression that had gone somewhere cold and contained. Carter's made a formal offer, he said without turning around. He's offering $8,000 for the South Field and the water rights attached to it. Eleanor kept her voice level. That's a low offer. The South Field has the best creek access on the property. The water rights alone are worth more than that to a ranch his size. He set the letter on the table. This isn't an offer. It's an opening move. What does he want you to do? Accept it by Friday, or he said he'll, and I'm reading directly. Thomas picked the letter back up. Proceed with the legal proceedings his attorney has been preparing regarding the disputed boundary survey. Eleanor crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and picked up the letter herself. She read it twice, looked at the signature, looked at the date. He's bluffing, she said. Thomas turned around. How do you know? Because if his lawyer had a case strong enough to win, he wouldn't be offering $8,000 first. He'd go straight to court. She set the letter down. He found the survey discrepancy. He thinks it gives him enough to make you nervous. He's hoping you'll take the money rather than risk the legal fight. She looked up at Thomas. Has Reeve responded yet? Not yet. Then we wait for Reeve before we respond to Carter. We don't move until we know what we have. She put her hand on the letter, palm flat. Do not respond to this before we hear from Cheyenne. Thomas looked at her hand on the letter, looked at her face. He'll take my silence as weakness. Let him, Eleanor said. Carter thinks you're alone out here and scared and behind on your accounts and fighting a legal problem you don't understand. Let him keep thinking that for a little longer. Her voice was even deliberate. He doesn't know we found the discrepancy first. He doesn't know we've already contacted Reeve. He doesn't know what we know. The word we settled in the kitchen like something that had been said by accident and was too true to take back. Thomas looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Not gratitude that was too simple. Not admiration too distant. Something in between that was specifically his, the expression of a man who had stopped expecting to be surprised and was finding he could no longer stop it. All right, he said. We wait. Reeve's response came 4 days later by telegraph, terse and professional, and exactly what Eleanor had been hoping for. She read it 3 times, standing at the telegraph office window, while the operator pretended not to be watching her. She rode back to the ranch faster than she'd ridden anything in years. Thomas met her at the gate. He must have seen something in how she was riding, because his face was already alert and braced. Reeve says the 1879 survey error is documented, she said, dismounting before the mare had fully stopped. There was a surveyor's error report filed in the territorial records in 1880, 1 year after the survey. Reeve says he found it in 20 minutes. She handed Thomas the telegraph paper. The error was acknowledged, and the original land grant boundary was confirmed as controlling. Carter's lawyer either didn't find the 1880 filing or chose not to disclose it. Thomas read the paper. He read it again. Carter's case, he said slowly, never existed. Not the way he was framing it, Eleanor said. The 1880 filing kills his argument entirely. She met Thomas's eyes. He was bluffing. The entire 18 months, the lawyer, the pressure, the $8,000 offer. All of it was pressure built on a document he hoped you'd never dig far enough to find the answer to. Thomas looked up from the telegraph paper. His expression was doing something she had not seen it do before, a complex, compressed movement of emotions, rage and relief arriving at the same moment, and wrestling for space. He knew, Thomas said. Carter knew that filing existed. His lawyer had to have found it. Almost certainly, Eleanor said. So he was running a fraud. The word landed hard and flat. He was trying to steal my land using a legal fiction he knew he couldn't win in court. Yes, Eleanor said. And he nearly succeeded. If you hadn't been able to produce the original land grant and the 1879 survey together, if Reeve hadn't known to look for the 1880 filing. She didn't finish the sentence. Thomas stood at his gate with the telegraph paper in his hand and looked at his Southfield, the best creek access on the property. The water rights worth more than Carter's entire insulting offer. The land his father had broken his back to secure and his wife had helped him fight to keep. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned to Eleanor and said, I want to respond to Carter's letter now. Reeve should draft the formal response, Eleanor said. But I can help you write the first letter. Not a lawyer's letter, Thomas said. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. I want to write it myself, and I want him to understand that I know exactly what he did. Eleanor looked at him, at the set of his jaw, at the particular stillness of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was now done being patient. All right, she said. Let's go inside. They wrote the letter together. Thomas dictated. Eleanor refined. It was 3 paragraphs. It was direct. It named the 1880 territorial filing specifically. It referenced Aldous Reeve by name. And it stated without aggression, but without any ambiguity whatsoever, that Hayes Ranch's southern boundary was not now and had never been in legitimate dispute, and that any further legal action based on the 1879 survey discrepancy would be met with a formal complaint to the territorial bar, regarding the professional conduct of Carter's attorney. The final line was Thomas's entirely. Eleanor didn't change a word of it. If you wish to purchase water access for your eastern grazing land, Mr. Carter, I am willing to discuss a fair lease arrangement. But that conversation begins with you understanding that what you attempted here is known, and it will not be forgotten. Eleanor read it twice. That last line, she said. Too much, Thomas said. No, she said. It's exactly right. She folded the letter. He needs to know you're not the man he thought you were 6 months ago, that things have changed. Thomas looked at her. Things have changed, he said. She sealed the letter and didn't answer because the way he'd said it meant something that she wasn't ready to address directly, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed. The letter went out that afternoon. Carter's reply, brief formal retreating, arrived 6 days later. What arrived in between those 6 days was something neither Thomas nor Eleanor had planned for. The town of Coldwater started talking about them differently. It began with Gerald Carmichael, who had apparently told someone about the bank meeting the way Eleanor had walked into his office, sat down without being invited, and proceeded to run the entire conversation. That story spread the way stories in small towns spread, accumulating detail and emphasis at each retelling. By the third day, the version circulating had Eleanor correcting Gerald Carmichael's ledgers to his face and identifying 3 bank errors he hadn't noticed. This was an exaggeration. She chose not to correct it. By the 5th day, people knew about the hay supplier and the $600. That one was entirely accurate, and it landed differently than the bank story, because farmers and ranchers understood what $600 meant, and they understood what it meant that Dawson's Feed had been running that scheme for long enough that the math on other accounts was now something every rancher in the county was quietly reconsidering. Doris Carmichael arrived at the ranch on the 5th morning without sending word ahead. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with the accounts when the knock came. Thomas was out with the horses. She opened the door herself. Doris stood on the porch with a pineapple from the smell of it, and an expression that was doing a complicated negotiation between her previous position and a revised one. Miss Whitfield, Doris said. Mrs. Carmichael, Eleanor said. Please come in. Doris came in. She set the pie on the table with the particular care of a woman who had brought a peace offering and wasn't entirely sure she was happy about it. She sat down across from Eleanor without being asked, which Eleanor considered a good sign. It meant she felt at home enough to drop the formality. I owe you an apology, Doris said without preamble. Eleanor waited. I judged the situation incorrectly, Doris said. I judged you incorrectly. She pressed her lips together briefly. I was operating on assumptions I should not have made. You were concerned about Thomas, Eleanor said. Yes, Doris said. This community has watched Thomas Hayes fall apart for 4 years. He was a good man before Clara died. After he just closed himself off, stopped coming to church, stopped coming to social events, just worked and shut the world out. She looked at her hands. When Margaret arranged this whole business without his agreement, I was angry on his behalf. And then when I saw you at the station, and you were when I saw how the situation had... She stopped. When you saw a woman who'd been abandoned at a train station, Eleanor said gently. Doris looked up. I'm sorry, she said, for the way the town treated that. The town didn't do anything, Eleanor said. The town watched. That's what towns do. She paused. I appreciate the apology, Mrs. Carmichael. I genuinely do. Doris looked at the account ledgers spread across the table. Gerald told me what you found in the bank records. He didn't have to tell me, but he said he thought I should know. She looked up. He also said you were the sharpest mind he'd encountered in a business meeting since... She stopped again. Since, Eleanor said. Since Clara Hayes came in to dispute a loan term in 1880 and walked out with a better rate than Gerald had intended to offer, Doris said. There was a ghost of a smile on her face. Gerald has apparently been bested by the women of this ranch twice in 1 decade. Eleanor considered that for a moment. Clara sounds like she was formidable. She was extraordinary, Doris said, and the simple directness of it was more eulogy than anything fancier could have been. Thomas loved her the way some men are only capable of loving once, when she died. She shook her head. We thought we'd lost him too, just a different way. He's still here, Eleanor said. Yes? Doris said, looking at her. He is. And he's different these past 2 weeks than he's been in 4 years. She held Eleanor's gaze. I don't know what's between the two of you, and it isn't my business and I'm not asking. But whatever it is, it's brought him back at least part way. And this town is grateful for that, even if it was too proud to say it before. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Because the thing Doris was describing, the change in Thomas, was something Eleanor had been carefully not naming even to herself, because naming it felt like a claim she had no right to make. I'm glad he's doing better, Eleanor said finally. He has a good ranch. It deserves his full attention. Doris looked at her with the expression of a woman who heard exactly what Eleanor had and had not said, and was wise enough not to push on either one. The pie is apple, Doris said, standing. Clara's recipe, actually she shared it with half the women in this county before she passed. I thought you might like to have it. Eleanor looked at the pie, felt something catch in her chest. Thank you, she said. That was very thoughtful. After Doris left, Eleanor sat at the table for a long moment without touching the accounts. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had organized documents in a blue tin box and planted roses from her mother's cuttings, and negotiated loan terms with Gerald Carmichael, and shared her pie recipe with every woman in the county. A woman who had made this ranch into a home, and then left it, and left a man behind who had spent 4 years not quite believing she was gone. Thomas came in from the yard and stopped when he saw the pie. Doris Carmichael, Eleanor said. What did she want? She apologized. Eleanor picked up her pen. And she brought you Clara's apple pie. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones Eleanor had catalogued before. This one had weight and texture. She didn't look up. Thomas crossed to the table. She heard him sit down. Heard him after a long moment say very quietly, She used to make that every October. It's July, Eleanor said. I know. A pause. I think Doris was making a point. Several of them probably, Eleanor said. He was quiet. Eleanor went back to the accounts. Then Thomas said, Eleanor, can I ask you something? You've been asking me things for 2 weeks, she said. You don't need to preface it. When you left Georgia, he said. When you decided to come here, what were you hoping for, honestly? Not what you told the agency or my mother. What were you hoping for? She set her pen down. The question deserved an honest answer. She had learned that much about Thomas Hayes. He asked direct questions because he could hear indirect answers, and he found them more painful than silence. He was a man who had been through too much to have patience for anything less than the truth. I was hoping for someone who would look at me and not see the first thing they always see, she said. Someone who would have a conversation with me before they decided what I was worth. She paused. I'd spent 26 years in a world that made its calculations about me before I opened my mouth. I wanted to be somewhere different. I wanted someone to give me a fair chance before they decided. She looked at the accounts. I didn't expect Wyoming. I didn't expect any of this, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. Thomas was quiet for a long time. The calculation you're talking about, he said slowly. People did that to you everywhere. Everywhere I went. Because of your size. Partly, Eleanor said. And partly because I was a woman without family money or social connections. Partly because I wasn't what people expected to see when they pictured someone worth taking seriously. She picked up her pen again. It's a very old story. It's a wrong story, Thomas said. His voice was even, flat with a controlled anger that surprised her. The people who looked at you and decided before they knew you, they missed everything important. Eleanor kept her eyes on the ledger. Yes, she said after a moment. They did. I was one of them, he said. The pen stopped. You canceled before you met me, she said carefully. I formed an opinion before I met you, Thomas said. That's the same thing. I decided the whole situation was something I could dismiss without... He stopped. I was wrong. Eleanor looked up then. Looked at him directly. He was looking back with the expression she had no name for, yet the one that was specifically his, the one she had been cataloging from the first night and hadn't finished understanding. "Thomas," she said, "you lost someone. You were protecting yourself." "I was hiding," he said. "There's a difference." She held his gaze. "You told me something," he said. "The day you stayed. You told me being afraid of losing someone isn't the same as honoring the person you lost." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking about that every day since you said it." Eleanor didn't answer. "Clara wouldn't have wanted this," he said. "What I've been doing, shutting everything out. She was the least. She never wasted anything. Not a day. Not a good piece of soil. Not a recipe that other people might enjoy." His voice was steady, but she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. "She would have been furious at me. For the ledgers alone, she would have—" He stopped. A sound that was almost a laugh, rough and short and real. "She would have done exactly what you did. Sat down, opened the box, and started from the beginning." Eleanor felt something shift in the room. Something careful and significant, like a door moving on new hinges. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Eleanor said. "She would have liked you," Thomas said. "Immensely." He looked at the apple pie on the table, then back at Eleanor. "I don't want to dishonor what she was to me by pretending I'm past it. I'm not. I don't know if I ever will be entirely." He paused. "But I also don't want to keep using grief as an excuse to refuse the life that's still in front of me." He met her eyes. "I've been refusing a great deal." Eleanor set her pen down completely. "Thomas," she said, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm choosing to." He held her gaze steadily. "I don't know what this is between us. I know it's something. I know that this ranch feels like a place I want to be again, instead of just a place I'm surviving. And I know that started the night you sat at this table and showed me what I'd been losing." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something she would have preferred it not do. Something warm and dangerous and very difficult to be practical about. "I'm still a woman who arrived as an unwanted mail-order bride," she said, "and a worker you hired for $2 a week." "Your 2 weeks were up 5 days ago," Thomas said. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "2 weeks," he said. "That was our arrangement. It's been 17 days. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the accounts spread across the table, the corrected ledgers, the supplier letters, the property document, copies the telegraph from Reeve the draft of Carter's response. "I didn't notice," she said, which was possibly the most honest thing she had said to him. "I noticed," Thomas said. "I noticed on day 15, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to leave." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas, stay," he said. Not as a plea, not as a request dressed up as a statement. Just the word direct and unadorned from a man who had relearned very recently that the truth said plainly was the only version worth saying. Not for the account, not for the arrangement. Stay, because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am better, and I think you might be too. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the tin box, the roses, the $42 that were no longer the perimeter of her world. She thought about Doris Carmichael's apology, and Gerald Carmichael's backpedaling, and a town that was slowly, grudgingly revising its initial verdict. She thought about a woman named Clara, who had shared her pie recipe with everyone she knew because she understood that good things were meant to be shared. She thought about what it meant to be in a place where someone had seen the first thing and kept looking. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Why morning?" "Because I make better decisions in the morning," Eleanor said. "And this is a decision I want to make well." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, stood, walked to the door, turned back once. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. The tomatoes are coming in," he said. 3 of them are nearly ripe." A pause. "Clara would have been pleased about that." And he went out into the evening, and the door closed behind him, and Eleanor Whitfield sat alone at the kitchen table with the accounts and the apple pie and the particular quality of feeling that came from standing at the exact edge of a life you hadn't planned, but might, if you were very careful and very brave, choose anyway. She did not sleep well that night. But in the morning, when the light came through the barn window, and the Wyoming air smelled like summer grass and something baking, she got up. She dressed, she pinned her hair, and she went downstairs. And Thomas Hayes was standing at the bottom of the stairs with 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of a man who had been up before dawn, deciding how to be brave. And he held 1 cup out to her, and she took it, and neither of them said the word she had told him to ask in the morning. They didn't need to. Some answers didn't require words, but what came next would require everything both of them had left. Because William Carter had not taken the letter as his final answer, and the war for Hayes Ranch was not over. It was only beginning. Carter's reply arrived on a Monday. It was not the retreat they had expected. Thomas read it at the kitchen table, while Eleanor stood at the counter with her coffee, and she knew from the way his shoulders changed, a subtle contained tightening, like a man who had been bracing for a blow and just felt it land, that whatever was in the letter was not the formal withdrawal Aldous Reeve had predicted. "He's filed," Thomas said. Eleanor set down her cup. "Filed what?" "A formal claim with the Territorial Land Office." Thomas set the letter on the table. His voice was very even, too even. "Not based on the survey discrepancy." He shifted his argument. His lawyer found a different angle. Eleanor crossed to the table and picked up the letter. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. Carter's attorney had filed a claim asserting that the water rights attached to the South Creek had never been formally registered under Eleanor's name in the territorial water records, that the original land grant had transferred land title, but that the water rights under an 1876 territorial ordinance required a separate registration that Thomas's father had apparently never completed. Eleanor read the relevant paragraph 3 times. "Thomas," she said carefully, "did your father ever file a separate water rights registration, not as part of the land grant separately with the Territorial Water Office?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "He handled all of that. When he died, the estate passed to me through Reeve's office. Reeve reviewed the land title. I don't know if he reviewed the water registration separately." "We need to know today," Eleanor said. "It's Monday," Thomas said. "Reeve's office is in Cheyenne, 2 days by telegraph." "Then we telegraph today, and we pay for the urgent rate," Eleanor said. She was already at the writing desk pulling out paper. "What's the name of the Territorial Water Office?" "I don't." "It would be the Territorial Office of Land and Water Resources," Eleanor said, writing as she spoke. "Established 1873 under the Wyoming Organic Act. If your father's registration is there, it has a filing date and a document number, and Carter's lawyer knows that we can find it if we look." She stopped writing and looked up. "Which means if he filed this claim, he either knows the registration doesn't exist, or he's gambling that we won't find it before the response deadline." "What's the deadline?" Eleanor checked the letter. 21 days from date of filing. The filing was dated 4 days ago. She looked at Thomas. "We have 17 days. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing he did when he was holding anger very tightly, pressing both hands flat on the table surface, breathing slowly, not speaking, until he could trust the words to come out the way he wanted them. "He's not going to stop," Thomas said. "No." Eleanor agreed. "Even after Reeve's letter. Even after we proved the survey argument was false." He looked at the Carter letter. "He's going to keep coming until he finds something that sticks, or until I run out of money to fight him. Or until we find everything there is to find," Eleanor said, "before he does." Thomas looked at her. "And if the water registration doesn't exist?" Eleanor held his gaze. "Then we figure out what to do about that. But we don't assume the worst until we know the truth." She put her pen to the paper. "I'm writing to Reeve. You write to the Territorial Water Office directly. I'll give you the language. We send both today." Thomas pulled a chair out and sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was different. Close enough that she could hear him breathe, close enough that the warmth of him was a physical fact she was aware of in a way she kept carefully not reacting to. "Tell me what to write," he said. She told him. He wrote. She wrote. And in 40 minutes, 2 letters were sealed and ready, and the alderman boy, who had apparently made himself available as a general messenger for Hayes Ranch over the past week possibly, because Eleanor had started sending him home with apples from the kitchen garden, was dispatched to town to send them. The waiting was harder than the working. Eleanor had never been good at waiting. She filled it the way she always filled uncomfortable spaces with useful motion. She reorganized the tool shed, which had been bothering her since day 3. She patched 2 sections of fence along the north pasture that Thomas hadn't gotten to. She harvested the first of the tomatoes, 3 of them, red and heavy and exactly right, and set them on the kitchen windowsill because she didn't want to eat them alone. Thomas found her there on the afternoon of the second day. Both of them in the kitchen, the silence full of the unspoken weight of waiting for answers neither of them could control. "I want to tell you something," he said, sitting down without preamble. Eleanor turned from the window. "All right. When Clara died," he said, "the thing nobody tells you is that it's not the grief that gets you, not at first. It's the stillness. The house being still. The way you stop talking out loud because there's no one to talk to." He looked at the table. "I stopped talking to people. I stopped talking to myself. I just went quiet. And after a while, quiet becomes its own kind of living. You stop expecting noise. You stop leaving room for it." Eleanor sat down. She didn't say anything because he wasn't finished. "The night you sat at this table and started asking me questions about the hay supplier," he said. "It was the first time in 2 years that I had talked to another person past sundown about anything that mattered." He looked up. "I didn't realize how much I'd been missing it until it was happening." "Talking about hay suppliers," Eleanor said carefully. The corner of his mouth moved. "Talking about anything." He looked at her directly. The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I know this situation is, I know what it started as. I know I'm the man who left you standing at a train station. I haven't forgotten that, and I don't expect you to forget it either." He paused. "I just want you to know that whatever happens with Carter, whatever you decide about staying or going, you changed something here, in this house." He looked at the wall briefly, and she understood he meant something larger than the physical wall. "You brought the noise back, and I'm grateful." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $42. The empty boarding house room in Savannah receiving a telegram she never read. The platform at Coldwater Station and the station clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. She thought about the specific calculation she had made on that platform. Not to cry, not to beg, not to make herself small enough to disappear, and how that calculation had led her to this kitchen and this table, and this man who was looking at her with an expression she now had a name for. It was the expression of someone who had been found. Not rescued, found. The way you found a thing you had given up looking for and then recognized with a shock of rightness the moment you saw it. "You know what I think," Eleanor said. "Tell me." "I think Clara was a remarkable woman," she said. "And I think grief as large as yours is only possible because love was that large first. And I think—" She stopped, looked at the tomatoes on the windowsill. "I think the right response to that kind of love isn't to seal the house against everything that comes after. I think the right response is to keep living in a way she would have recognized, in a way she would have respected." Thomas was very still. "She would have fixed the fence posts," Eleanor said. He made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, the real one, rough and startled, and entirely his. "She would have fixed them herself, and then been irritated that it needed doing." "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's what I thought." She met his eyes. "Keep living, Thomas." She would have wanted that. He looked at her for a long moment. "Stay," he said. Quiet, direct. The word he'd said before, but different now, fuller, more honest, carrying more of its own weight. "Not for the accounts. Not because you don't have anywhere else to go. Stay because you want to." Eleanor held his gaze. "Ask me again when this is settled," she said. "When Carter's finished and the ranch is secure and you know what you actually want, rather than what the crisis is making you feel." "Eleanor, I'm serious," she said. "I'm not saying no. I'm saying ask me when the dust has settled, because I want your answer to be yours, not the situation's." Thomas looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been outmaneuvered in the most tender way possible and knew it. "You are the most frustratingly reasonable person I have ever met," he said. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "That is the best thing anyone has said to me in years." Reeves' telegraph arrived on the morning of the 5th day. Eleanor read it before Thomas was awake, standing at the ranch gate in the early light with the boy from the telegraph office, who had ridden out specially because the message was marked urgent. She read it twice. Then she walked to the house, went up the back stairs, knocked on Thomas's door the first time she had ever knocked on it, and said through the wood, "Get up, Reeve found it." She heard him move, heard his boots. The door opened, and he was dressed except for his jacket, his hair not yet settled for the day, looking at her with the alert, braced expression she'd come to recognize as his version of hope held carefully in check. She handed him the telegraph paper. He read it. She watched his face. The water rights registration existed. Filed in 1874 by Thomas's father, Robert Hayes, with the Territorial Office of Land and Water Resources in Cheyenne. Document number 0092. Reeve had found it in the original filing ledgers, a handwritten entry, properly witnessed, properly dated. The registration had never lapsed. It had simply never been indexed in the secondary records that Carter's lawyer had searched, because the indexing of the 1874 filings had been incomplete, a known administrative gap that the Territorial Office had been slowly correcting since 1881. Carter's lawyer had searched the index. Reeve had searched the original ledgers. Thomas lowered the paper. "It exists," he said. "It always existed," Eleanor said. Carter's lawyer knew about the indexing gap. He was betting you wouldn't know to look in the original ledgers. She looked at Thomas steadily. "He built his entire case on the assumption that you were alone and uninformed and wouldn't know where to look." Thomas said nothing for a moment. He looked at the telegraph paper with the expression of a man absorbing something that was not just relief, but revelation. The understanding that he had been targeted not because he was vulnerable, but because he had appeared to be. And the thing that had made him appear vulnerable was the very grief and isolation that Carter had been watching and calculating from across the fence line for 4 years. "He watched me fall apart," Thomas said, "and then he planned around it." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He knew about Clara. He knew about the closed-up house and the neglected accounts and the 4 years of me not paying close enough attention to my own land." Thomas looked up. "He's been planning this since she died." "I believe so." "That's—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "That is the most contemptible thing I have heard in my life." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "And Reeve can prove it." The timeline of Carter's legal filings starting from shortly after Clara's death, combined with the fact that his lawyer searched the index, but not the original ledgers, which any competent attorney would have done unless he already knew what was and wasn't there. "Reeve says we have grounds for a formal complaint to the territorial bar." She paused. "And something else." Thomas looked at her sharply. "What?" "Reeve says the indexing gap itself. The incomplete indexing of the 1874 water registrations may affect other ranchers in this county. If Carter's lawyer knew about the gap and has been using it to challenge other water rights, this isn't just about Hayes Ranch." She met Thomas's eyes. This could be a pattern. The silence that followed was the specific silence of something getting larger. "Other ranchers," Thomas said slowly. "Reeve doesn't know yet. He's looking into it." She paused. "But if Carter has been doing this to other families, targeting people who appear isolated, searching incomplete records for vulnerabilities, filing claims they can't afford to fight, then we're not the only ones who need to know about the 1874 ledgers," Thomas said. "No," Eleanor said. "We're not." Thomas looked at the telegraph paper one more time. Then he set it on the table with the same careful deliberateness he used for all important documents. Now a habit he'd developed over the past 3 weeks, without her ever asking him, to one of those small absorbed behaviors that meant someone was changing from the inside. "I need to ride to the Alderman place," he said, "and the Brennan homestead south of town, and the Kowalski family out on the eastern road." He was already reaching for his jacket. "If Carter's been running the same scheme on other land—" "I'll write letters," Eleanor said, "to each of them. with the document number for the 1874 registrations and instructions on what to ask Reeve to search. She was already at the desk. "Thomas." He stopped. "Take someone with you," she said. "Don't ride to Carter's neighbors alone. Take one of your hands." He looked at her. "You think Carter would—" "I think a man who has been planning this for 4 years doesn't stop because one piece of his plan failed," Eleanor said. "Take someone." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression, the specific Thomas Hayes expression, of being surprised by someone who had just thought of something he should have thought of himself. Then he nodded, put his hat on, and went out. Eleanor sat down at the desk and began writing. She wrote 3 letters. One to the Alderman family, one to the Brennans, one to the Kowalskis. Each letter explained the indexing gap, the document number, to search the name of Reeves' office in Cheyenne, and what the original water rights registration would prove. Each letter also said with as much plainness as she could manage, "Carter's lawyer may have used this same gap against you. You are not alone in this. Please contact us." She was sealing the 3rd envelope when Thomas came back, and he came back fast, the particular speed of a man returning with information he needs to share. "Alderman," he said, pulling his hat off. "Old Jim Alderman. He's been fighting a water rights dispute with Carter for 8 months. He took a loan against the ranch to pay his lawyer because he couldn't afford the fight otherwise." Eleanor's pen stopped. "His lawyer told him the water registration couldn't be found," Thomas said. "Told him he might have to settle." He looked at her. "His lawyer, Eleanor. Carter's lawyer. Carter's lawyer told Alderman's lawyer that the registration couldn't be found." The full shape of it arrived in Eleanor's mind all at once, not like a surprise because she had been forming the edges of it for days, but like the last piece of a picture sliding into place. The resolution was brutal in its clarity. "Carter has been bribing lawyers," she said, "or placing them, or using connections to ensure that the ranchers he targets get legal counsel that reports back to him." She set the envelope down. "That's not opportunism. That's a system." "That's fraud," Thomas said. His voice was very quiet and very hard. "That's criminal fraud. That's not a land dispute. That's theft." "Yes," Eleanor said. Thomas stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands and the controlled fury of a man who had been raised to believe that a man's land was the foundation of his dignity and everything built on it, and who had just understood that someone had been systematically dismantling that foundation for people across this entire county. "I need to go to Gerald Carmichael," he said. Eleanor looked up. "The bank. Gerald knows every rancher in this county and their financial situation. If Carter has been targeting families under financial stress—" He stopped. "Gerald will know who's at risk, and Gerald—" He stopped again. Something complicated moved across his face. "Gerald plays cards with Carter on Thursdays," Eleanor said. "Yes," Thomas said. "And Gerald sent a letter to this ranch 8 months ago about a misfiled tax payment and then never followed up." He met Eleanor's eyes. "I want to know if that was carelessness or something else." The question landed between them with all its weight. Eleanor held his gaze. "Do you trust Gerald Carmichael?" "I trusted him," Thomas said. "I don't know what I trust right now." He ran a hand over his face. "Doris would never. She's difficult, but she's honest. She is genuinely honest. But Gerald and Carter, they've been close for years. And if Gerald knew about the indexing gap—" "Then the letter about the misfiled tax payment was not carelessness," Eleanor said. "Then it was a warning shot," Thomas said. "A way of showing Carter that Hayes Ranch was financially vulnerable, giving him the signal to move." They looked at each other across the kitchen. "We need Reeve here," Eleanor said. "Not just letters and telegraphs. We need him in Coldwater in person with the original ledger documents before we confront anyone." She picked up her pen. "Let me write him today. I'll ask him to come this week if he can." "He'll charge for the travel," Thomas said. "He'll charge less than a land settlement would cost," Eleanor said. She had already started writing. Thomas sat down. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel the weight of what he was carrying, not just the legal situation, which was bad enough, but the thing underneath it. The particular specific pain of discovering that the isolation he had retreated into after Clara's death had been noted and mapped and used against him by someone who had calculated exactly how long a grieving man's attention would remain elsewhere. "I let this happen," Thomas said quietly. Eleanor looked up. "No, I stopped paying attention. I closed everything down, and while I was grieving, he was planning." He looked at the window. "If I had been paying attention the way I should have been, Thomas." Her voice was firm. Not harsh firm, the way you were firm with someone who was about to say something deeply unfair about themselves. "You lost your wife. You survived 4 years. You kept this ranch running, which is not a small thing. The fact that someone chose to exploit your grief does not make your grief the error." She held his gaze. "Carter made a choice. A deliberate, predatory, sustained choice. That is his fault, not yours." Thomas looked at her. She had learned to hold his gaze now. In the beginning, it had been something she had to choose to not look away first, to not reduce herself to make the space more comfortable. Now it was simply where she looked when she talked to him. Directly. Straight on. The way she should have always been able to look at people, and had only recently begun to allow herself. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Saying the thing I needed to hear before I knew I needed to hear it." Eleanor looked back at the letter. "I'm saying what's true," she said. "That's all I ever do." "Oh," Thomas said. "That's why it works." Reeve arrived on a Wednesday 4 days after Eleanor's urgent letter, which meant he had left Cheyenne within 48 hours of receiving it, which meant he understood the situation's urgency more than he had let on in his telegraphs. How was a small, precise man of about 60, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades watching other people's crises, and had developed the professional composure of a person who understood that urgency was best managed by remaining very calm at its center. He arrived with a leather document case that Eleanor suspected weighed close to 20 pounds, and the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to reserve judgment until he'd seen everything. He shook Thomas's hand at the door. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "the letter you wrote was exceptionally clear, better than most legal correspondence I receive." "I've had practice being precise," Eleanor said, "so I gathered." He came inside, set the case on the table. "I've brought the original 1874 ledger page, a certified copy, prepared by the Territorial Office archivist this morning before I left. I also have a deposition from the archivist regarding the indexing gap and its extent." He looked at Thomas. "The gap, Mr. Hayes, affects 31 water rights registrations filed between 1873 and 1876, all of them in this county." The kitchen went very still. 31, Eleanor said. "All from this county," Reeve confirmed. "Which is not a statistical coincidence. The original registrations were correctly filed and correctly kept. The incomplete indexing was a specific failure of the secondary index completed in 1879, and the 1879 index was compiled under a contract awarded to a private firm." He looked between them. "A firm that was majority-owned at the time of the contract by a man named Harlan Webb." Thomas said, "Who is Harlan Webb?" "I was William Carter's father-in-law," Reeve said. "He died in 1882, but the firm still exists, and the man who currently manages it on behalf of Carter's wife as a beneficiary of Webb's estate." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a picture completing itself entirely. "Carter's family firm created the indexing gap," Eleanor said. "I believe so," Reeve said. "I cannot prove intent without a court proceeding. But the documentary evidence of ownership, combined with the systematic nature of the incomplete indexing. 31 registrations, all in one county, all from the same 4-year window, is sufficient basis for a formal investigation by the Territorial Attorney General's office." Thomas stood up, sat down, stood up again. "This isn't just about my land." "No," Reeve said. "This is a 15-year scheme, Mr. Hayes. Carter's family created a legal vulnerability in the records waited for families to weaken, whether through financial stress, death, illness, poor seasons, and then exploited the gap they had built." He paused. "Your wife's death appears from the timing of Carter's first legal filings to have been the event that made Hayes Ranch a target." Thomas's chair scraped back from the table. Eleanor put her hand on his arm without thinking. Just her hand on his arm. A steadying touch, the kind that said, "I'm here," without saying anything. He didn't pull away. He stood there for a moment with Eleanor's hand on his arm, and Reeve waiting with professional patience. And he breathed, and he came back from wherever he had gone, and he sat back down. "What do we do?" he said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man choosing action over fury because someone next to him was steady enough to make that choice possible. "You file a formal statement with the Territorial Attorney General's office," Reeve said. "You provide the certified copy of the 1874 registration. I have already drafted the complaint. I simply need your signature and Miss Whitfield's witness." He opened the leather case. "And then you contact every one of the 31 registered water rights holders in this county whose registration appears in the 1874 through 1876 ledgers, and you tell them what you found." Eleanor was already thinking about the letters. The names Reeve would need to give her. The precise language. The correct order of information so that frightened people could understand quickly what was happening and what to do. "How long does the Attorney General investigation take?" she asked. "Months likely," Reeve said. "But the formal complaint once filed creates a legal stay on any pending disputes connected to the indexing gap, which means Carter's current filing against your water rights dies," Thomas said. "Is stayed pending investigation," Reeve said with the precision of a man who preferred accurate language to satisfying language. "Which in practical terms means Carter cannot take action against Hayes Ranch during the investigation period." Thomas looked at Eleanor. She looked back. "We need a name for each of those 31 registrations," she said to Reeve. "I have them," Reeve said, and pulled a typed sheet from the case. "I anticipated you'd want to contact them." Eleanor took the sheet, read the names, recognized 3. She knew the Aldermans, a family called Pierce, she'd heard Thomas mention, and the Kowalski name from the Eastern Road. 28 others she didn't know yet. She would know them. She would write every letter herself. "The complaint document," she said to Reeve. "Where do I sign as witness?" Reeve looked at her with what might in a less restrained man have been a smile. "Page 4, he said. "Lower left." She signed. Thomas signed, and Reeve blotted the ink and returned the papers to the leather case with the careful, unhurried motion of a man who had just secured something important. Outside, the Wyoming summer was at its peak, the kind of afternoon that turned the light gold and long and made everything look like it had been waiting to be exactly what it was. Eleanor could hear Thomas's horses in the pasture. She could hear faintly the water in the South Creek that Carter had spent 15 years trying to steal. She thought about the tin box under the back room shelf with Clara's handwriting on every receipt. She thought about a woman who had planted roses from her mother's cuttings and shared her pie recipe and negotiated loan terms and kept every document in perfect order because she had understood the way Eleanor understood the way certain women always understood that the details were not small. The details were everything. The details were the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't. She thought about 31 families who did not yet know what she knew, and she picked up her pen and she started writing the first letter. Thomas watched her for a moment from across the table. Reeve was reviewing the complaint document one final time. The kitchen was full of the particular busy silence of important work, being done by people who understood its importance. Thomas reached across the table and set his hand over Eleanor's very briefly. Not stopping her, not interrupting the letter. Just for a moment, his hand over hers. She did not look up, but she felt it, and she kept writing. The letters went out on a Thursday. Eleanor had written all 28 of them by hand, working through 2 nights with a lamp and a pot of coffee that Thomas refilled without being asked. Sitting across from her in the kind of silence that had long since stopped being uncomfortable and become instead something she would have difficulty describing to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to fill the space between them, because the space itself had become a kind of home. Reeve left for Cheyenne on Friday morning with the signed complaint and a certified copy of the 1874 ledger page, and the deposition from the territorial archivist and his parting words to Eleanor, delivered at the ranch gate with Thomas standing beside her, were precise and unembellished in the way of everything Aldous Reeve said. "Miss Whitfield," he said. In 40 years of practice, I have met perhaps a dozen people who could have identified what you identified in the time you identified it with the resources you had available. He picked up his reins. Thomas, you are a fortunate man. He did not wait for a response. He rode out. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the road. He's not wrong, Thomas said. He's a careful man, Eleanor said. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. No, Thomas agreed. He doesn't. He looked at her sidelong with the expression she had catalogued so many times, now that she could read it, the way she read ledger columns, the careful, deliberate expression of a man choosing his moment. Eleanor. Not yet, she said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to ask me again, she said. And I told you to ask me when the dust settled. The dust hasn't settled. Reeve is in Cheyenne. The complaint hasn't been filed. The 28 families haven't responded. She looked at him, then directly fully the way she always looked at him now. Ask me when it's finished. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and went to check the south fence line, and Eleanor went inside to start the breakfast, and the morning moved forward, the way mornings did on a working ranch, without ceremony, without pause, with the plain and steady momentum of a life that had things to do. The first response to Eleanor's letters came 3 days later. It was from a woman named Ruth Pierce, whose husband had died the previous winter and who had been fighting a water rights dispute with Carter's lawyer entirely alone for 6 months, spending money she didn't have on legal counsel that had twice advised her to settle. Ruth's letter was 2 pages handwritten in the tight, controlled script of a woman who was holding herself very carefully together. The last paragraph said, "I did not know there was anyone else. I thought I was the only one he was doing this to. I thought it was something I had done wrong." Eleanor read that paragraph 3 times. Then she set the letter down, went to the back room, sat on the floor next to the blue tin box with Clara's handwriting on it, and allowed herself 2 full minutes of the kind of emotion she did not permit in public. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen, and wrote Ruth Pierce a response that was 4 pages long and contained every piece of information Ruth needed to contact Reeve's office, file her own statement, and understand that she had done nothing wrong, and that the system that had been used against her was not the law. It was a crime being committed with legal language, and it was about to be answered. Thomas found her still writing at noon. He read what was on the paper over her shoulder, which he had started doing sometime in the 3rd week without either of them remarking on it. The way you stopped remarking on things that had simply become normal. Ruth Pierce, he said. Her husband was one of the first ranchers in this valley. Good man. He died hard. He paused. She has 2 sons still on the property. She needs Reeve to file for her, Eleanor said. And she needs someone to tell her that the reason her lawyers kept advising her to settle is that Carter had likely reached them through the same channels he used to compromise Alderman's counsel. She looked up at Thomas. Can you ride out there in person? I think she needs to hear it from someone she knows, not just a letter. Thomas had his hat on before she finished the sentence. He came back that evening with Ruth Pierce's signed statement and the information that 3 of the neighboring families Ruth knew had been contacted by Carter's lawyer in the past year about water rights they believed were secure. It's bigger than 31, Eleanor said. Ruth thinks it may be as many as 50, Thomas said. Some of the older registrations pre-1873 may have a different vulnerability, a different gap in a different index. He set the statements on the table. Reeve needs to know. Eleanor was already writing the telegraph. What followed was the busiest 3 weeks of Eleanor Whitfield's life, which was saying something considerable, given the 3 weeks that had preceded them. Reeve filed the formal complaint with the Territorial Attorney General on a Monday. By Wednesday, the Attorney General's office had issued a stay on all pending water rights disputes in the county, pending investigation, 43 cases in total, which was 12 more than the 31. Eleanor and Reeve had identified, which meant the scheme was indeed broader than the 1874 ledgers had revealed. By Friday, 2 of Carter's lawyers, not the Cheyenne attorney, but 2 county-level attorneys who had been directing ranchers toward settlements had received formal notices from the territorial bar. The news moved through Coldwater, the way news moved in small towns, faster than any horse carried by voices and expressions, and the particular electric quality of a community. understanding that something large was happening and had been happening for a long time without most of them knowing. Gerald Carmichael came to the ranch on a Saturday morning. He came alone without Doris. He sat across from Thomas and Eleanor at the kitchen table, and he folded his hands on the surface, and he looked at the middle distance between them, and he said, "I need to tell you something." Eleanor said nothing. Thomas said nothing. They waited. "The tax payment error," Gerald said. "The letter I sent 8 months ago, the one I didn't follow up on." He unfolded his hands, folded them again. "Carter asked me to send it. He told me Hayes Ranch was a motivated seller, and that a notice of financial irregularity would make you more receptive to an offer." Gerald's voice was flat and carrying the weight of a man who has been living with a thing and is now putting it down. "He told me it was a business strategy, that it was just positioning." He looked at Thomas directly. "I didn't know what he was doing to the other ranchers. I didn't know about the index. I thought it was a negotiation tactic, and I should have known better, and I am telling you now because Doris—" He stopped. His voice had changed slightly. "Doris told me that if I didn't come here and tell you myself she would. And she would have been right to." The kitchen was very still. Thomas looked at Gerald Carmichael for a long time. Long enough that Eleanor could see Gerald's composure, developing the small fractures of a man who understood that he deserved whatever was about to come and was prepared to receive it. "Did you tell Carter about the property documents?" Thomas said. "About the land grant or the water registration?" "No," Gerald said. "I only knew about the tax error. That was the extent of it." "Did you tell him about Clara?" Thomas said. Something happened to Gerald's face, a specific kind of pain. "He already knew about Clara," Gerald said very quietly. "He brought her up himself. He said a man who had lost that much might want to simplify his holdings." His jaw tightened. "I told him I didn't think that was the right way to characterize it. That's when I knew the card evenings should stop." He looked at the table. "I stopped them 6 months ago. Too late, I know that." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald, I need you to make a formal statement to Reeves' office. Everything Carter said to you, every conversation, every date you can remember." Gerald looked up. "That'll put me in the investigation." "Yes," Thomas said. "It will. I could lose my position at the bank." "You might," Thomas said. "Or you might be the piece of testimony that proves Carter's coordination of the whole scheme." He held Gerald's gaze. "You have to decide what kind of man you want to have been when this is over." The silence between them was the kind that contained a genuine decision being made. Gerald unfolded his hands, placed them flat on the table, and said, "I'll write to Reeve today," after he left. Thomas sat at the table for a long moment and didn't say anything. Eleanor could feel what was moving through him. The complexity of a betrayal that was also in some part a confession by someone trying to correct themselves, and the difficulty of deciding what to do with that combination. "He didn't know the full extent of it," Eleanor said. "No," Thomas agreed. "But he knew enough." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did." She paused. "His statement could be critical, Thomas. Whatever else he did, his cooperation now." "I know," Thomas said. "I know." He was quiet for another moment. Then, Clara liked Doris, but she never entirely trusted Gerald. She used to say he was a man who wanted to be good, but found being comfortable easier. He looked at the window. She was usually right about people. "She was," Eleanor said. Thomas turned to look at her. "You know," he said, "you two would have argued constantly." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Is that a criticism?" "It's a compliment," Thomas said. "She only argued with people she respected." Something warm moved through Eleanor's chest. She looked back at her papers. "I'm going to take that as the highest praise I've received in Wyoming," she said. "It might be," Thomas said. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor heard the full thing in his voice. The grief still there, still real, still his, but underneath it, or alongside it, something else. Something that was not moving to replace the grief, but had found its own space beside it. Something that sounded unmistakably like a man who had come back to himself. The Territorial Attorney General's formal findings arrived in Coldwater on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after Reeve had filed the original complaint delivered by a territorial marshal, who also carried arrest warrants for Carter's Cheyenne attorney and the 2 county-level lawyers who had been redirecting settlers toward settlements. William Carter himself was served with a civil fraud complaint the same morning. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when Thomas came out to tell her. The tomatoes were fully in now, more than she had expected from a 3-week start in July, and she had been tying back the vines the way her mother had shown her when she was a girl in Georgia, a practical task that let her hands work while her mind went wherever it needed to go. Thomas came out and stood at the garden edge and said, "It's done." Eleanor straightened up and looked at him. "The warrants were served this morning," he said. "The civil complaint against Carter has been filed. Reeve says the fraud case is strong enough that Carter's attorneys in Cheyenne are already discussing terms." He paused. "Ruth Pierce's water rights are confirmed. The aldermen's are confirmed. Every one of the 43 stayed cases will be reviewed, and the registrations will be confirmed if they're in the original ledgers." He looked at Eleanor. "It's done." Eleanor looked at the tomato vines in her hands. She thought about a Monday morning in July when she had stepped off a train in Wyoming with $42 and 1 suitcase, and the particular quality of fury that came from a person who had been dismissed one too many times and had decided quietly and permanently that she was done accepting it. She thought about a kitchen table and a ledger and a lamp and a man who brought coffee without being asked. She thought about a blue tin box and rose cuttings from Missouri and a pie recipe shared across an entire county, and the way certain people built things that outlasted them, not in stone or wood, but in the small organized kindnesses that other people found and carried forward without knowing whose hands had made them. She set the vine ties down. "Eleanor," Thomas said. His voice was different now. The careful, braced quality was gone. What was underneath it was the real thing, no longer held in check by crisis or timing or her own sensible requests for him to wait. Just real. Just his. "The dust has settled." She looked at him. "Ask me," she said. He walked to the garden edge. He did not stay at the edge. He stepped over the low rail and came to where she was standing among the tomato vines and the green smell of growing things. And he stood close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face, the one she had no name for, yet, the one she had been cataloging since the first night, the one she now understood was simply Thomas Hayes, looking at someone he loved. "Stay," he said. "Not as my bookkeeper, not as my account manager, not because you saved this ranch or found the documents or wrote the letters." He paused. "Stay because I love you, because this house is not the same house it was in July, and neither am I, and you are the reason for both of those things." He looked at her steadily. "Stay, because I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never once feel the way you felt on that platform. Because you deserve someone who sees you, all of you, exactly as you are, and considers it the best fortune of his life." His voice was even, certain. Not the speech of a man who had rehearsed, but of a man who had lived with the truth of something long enough that it came out simply. "I see you, Eleanor. I have seen you since the night you sat down at my table and showed me what I'd been losing." He paused one more time. "Stay, please." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 26 years of being looked at and not seen. Of rooms she had walked into and immediately understood that the verdict had already been delivered before she opened her mouth. Of a life spent being excellent at everything she was allowed to do and shut out of everything she wasn't, and the particular weariness of that, the bone-deep, patient, persistent exhaustion of being underestimated by everyone you met. She thought about Thomas Hayes standing at the corner of his house with a hammer in his hand, looking at the woman he had rejected and having the grace to seem troubled by what his rejection had cost her. She thought about coffee brought without being asked, a hand over hers briefly while she wrote. She thought about the way he had said Clara would have liked you, immensely, and how those 4 words had undone something in her that she hadn't known was held. "Yes," Eleanor said, "just the word. Clean and complete and carrying everything." Thomas looked at her. She looked back, and then she laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, because standing in a tomato garden in Wyoming in September saying yes to a man who had once canceled her arrival by telegram, was possibly the most unexpected moment of her life. And the unexpectedness of it, the sheer implausible rightness of it, was genuinely funny to her in a way that felt like breathing after a very long time of not quite getting enough air. Thomas laughed too. Also short. Also real. And it was a sound so different from the man who had stood at his kitchen door with a hammer and an expression like a sealed house that Eleanor felt the difference physically, the before and the after of it, the 4 years and the 6 weeks, and the specific courage it took to come back from somewhere that far down. He reached up and touched her face. One hand. His thumb at the line of her cheekbone, the gesture of a man making certain the real thing was real. She put her hand over his. They stood in the garden. Margaret Hayes arrived from Denver 3 weeks later, having received no fewer than 5 separate accounts of the events of the preceding months, from 5 different Coldwater residents who clearly could not help themselves. She arrived on a Thursday, which was the same day of the week that Eleanor had arrived in July, and she swept into the ranch house with the particular energy of a woman who had set something in motion 4 months ago and had opinions about how it had developed. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Thomas was at the table reviewing the account books. Eleanor was beside him, not across beside him. Close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, talking him through a supplier renegotiation she had been drafting. Margaret looked at the two of them. She looked at the kitchen, the repaired garden visible through the window, the organized shelves, the lamp positioned for 2 people to work by the 2 cups on the table. She looked at Thomas's face, and Margaret Hayes, who had spent 4 years watching her son move through his own house like a man with no reason to be in it, pressed both hands over her mouth and stood in her own kitchen doorway and wept. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind that came from watching something you had prayed for arrive in a form you hadn't anticipated but recognized immediately as the thing itself. Thomas was on his feet in a second. "Mama, I'm fine," Margaret said, waving him off, getting hold of herself with the speed of a woman who had been getting hold of herself for decades and was very good at it. "I'm perfectly fine. I just—" She looked at Eleanor. "You are exactly what I thought you were." Eleanor stood up. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm glad to finally meet you." "Margaret," the older woman said, crossing the kitchen. She took both of Eleanor's hands in hers. She was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, and fiercer, with bright eyes that missed nothing, and a grip that said she had been a working woman her whole life. "I owe you an apology." "You really don't. I arranged something without proper agreement, and it put you in a situation that could have been genuinely harmful," Margaret said firmly. "The intention was right. The method was wrong. I am sorry for the method." She looked at Eleanor directly. "And I am not sorry at all for the result." "Neither am I," Eleanor said. Margaret held her gaze for a moment. Then she squeezed her hands and released them, and looked at Thomas with the expression of a mother who has been worried for a very long time and is now finally not worried. "You look like yourself again," she said. Thomas crossed the kitchen and put his arms around his mother without saying anything, because some things were past the reach of words, and Margaret Hayes held her son and looked over his shoulder at Eleanor with eyes that were dry again and very certain. "Welcome home," she said, directly to Eleanor. Not to the room, not to the general situation. To Eleanor specifically, with all the weight of what home meant in a place that had been closed for 4 years and was now unmistakably open. Eleanor felt the word land in the center of her chest and take root. The wedding was in October. Not a large one. Thomas had not wanted large, and Eleanor had never needed it. Doris Carmichael organized everything with the particular efficiency of a woman who was making up for previous errors through excellent logistics. Ruth Pierce came with her 2 sons. The Alderman family came. Jim Alderman shook Eleanor's hand at the door of the church and held on for a moment too long with the grip of a man who understood what he was thanking her for. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. The territorial investigation into Carter's scheme was still ongoing. Gerald Carmichael's testimony had proven as critical as Thomas had predicted, and the civil fraud case against Carter himself was moving toward a resolution that Reeve described in characteristically restrained language as highly favorable for the impacted parties. Ruth Pierce had already received a formal acknowledgement of her water rights. The Alderman water dispute was resolved. 12 other families had received the same. Eleanor stood at the front of the church in a dress that Doris Carmichael had helped her alter, and that fit her exactly as she was, not smaller than she was, not managed or minimized, but exactly her in dark blue, with a high collar and a full skirt that moved when she walked. And she looked at Thomas waiting for her at the front, and Thomas looked at her, and the entire small crowded church fell away to the specific clarity of two people who had found each other through an improbable series of events, and had chosen each other deliberately and intended to keep doing so. Margaret Hayes sat in the front pew and held a handkerchief she didn't use. Eleanor walked to him without hesitation. What came after was not perfect. No life was perfect. The Carter investigation would take another year to fully resolve. There would be hard seasons and dry summers and disputes and difficulties and all the ordinary unromantic labor of keeping a ranch alive and a marriage real. Thomas would still wake some mornings carrying Clara's absence, the way weather carries memory quietly, persistently, as part of its nature, rather than something to be cured. Eleanor would still walk into rooms and encounter people whose first calculation about her was wrong, and she would still feel the old familiar weight of it before she decided, as she always decided, to keep walking. But Eleanor Hayes, the name fitting her, the way the dress fit her exactly, would manage the books and expand the garden and write letters and negotiate supplier contracts and know every document in every tin box on every shelf in that house. She would sit at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp lit for two, and she would know without question, without needing it, confirmed that the person across the table saw her, all of her, exactly as she was, and considered it the best fortune of his life. The woman who had sat alone on a wooden bench at Coldwater Station, with $42 and one suitcase, holding a letter that had promised her a new beginning, had not found the beginning she was promised. She had found something better. She had found a life she had built herself with her own hands and her own mind, and the particular fury of a woman who had been underestimated once too often, and had decided quietly and permanently that the underestimating was over. Eleanor Whitfield had arrived in Wyoming unwanted. Eleanor Hayes had become the heart of everything that mattered, and that every hard-won, improbable, magnificent inch of it